Hey guys, welcome back to our walkthrough of classic poetry. Today I want to go over the sonnet Ozymandias, which is by the English poet Percy Shelley, whose middle name I've given up trying to pronounce. Now there's a fascinating history surrounding this poem. It was written in the early 1800s, and it was a time at which England still had a lot of colonies all over the world. And their archaeologists were unearthing and transporting a lot of ancient history back to the Museum of England. And it was said that a partial statue was unearthed and sent back to the British Museum, and it was supposedly of the pharaoh Ramses II. Now, interestingly enough, the word Ozymandias is actually a name. It's an ancient Greek name for Ramses, so we can be fairly well certain that the inspiration for Percy Shelley's Ozymandias poem was this find from England that was kind of shrouded in mystery over this partial statue that was unearthed and then sent back to the British Museum. So I don't want to say any more about this poem until we read it. It's a really fascinating poem. I think you'll get a lot out of it. I mentioned that it's a sonnet, which is a style of poetry that we went over in the last walkthrough. So if you haven't yet gone through that walkthrough, I encourage you to do so, because we talk about exactly what makes a sonnet and why they're such a cool form of poetry. So as always, this poem is written down below so you can follow along as I read aloud. But here's Ozymandias. I met a traveler from an antique land who said, "Two vast and trunkless legs of stone stand in the desert. Near them on the sand half sunk a shattered visage lies, whose frown and wrinkled lip and sneer of cold command tell that its sculptor well those passions read, which yet survive, stamped on these lifeless things, the hand that mocked them, and the heart that fed. And on the pedestal these words appear, my name is Ozymandias, King of Kings. Look on my works, ye mighty, and despair. Nothing beside remains round the decay of that colossal wreck. Boundless and bare, the lone and level sands stretch far away." That's a really fascinating poem that deals with the issue of time and decay. Now, he starts off his poem by saying, I met a traveler from an antique land. Well, I'm from America, so to me, England itself might be considered an antique land, but since this poem was written by an Englishman in the early 1800s, when he says, I met a traveler from an antique land, he's probably referring to some place like ancient Greece, or in this case, ancient Egypt. And the traveler from the antique land begins to tell him a story. And he says that there are two vast and trunkless legs of stone that stand in the desert, and nothing else is around them. They're just these two legs of a broken in half statue that are standing in the desert, and there's nothing else around them, just these two massive legs of stone. But right next to the legs of stone lay this half-sunk head of the statue. And the reason why we know it's the head is because he calls it a shattered visage. He says half-sunk a shattered visage lies, but then he begins to describe it, and he says, whose frown and wrinkled lip and sneer of cold command tell that its sculptor knew the king well. Whoever sculpted this statue really knew the king. He knew how to preserve his sneer of cold command, you know, the features that are sculpted into this head of stone. So that's the situation that we have, is that there's these two massive legs of stone, and half buried in the sand next to them is the head of the statue that's been very well preserved. But then he notes that there's also something written at the feet of the statue on the pedestal. And what is written on there says, my name is Ozymandias, King of Kings. Look on my works, ye mighty, and despair. So we get this idea that at one time in the very distant past, this statue stood in the middle of this thriving metropolis, you know, probably a commerce city where people would come far and wide all across the globe. And the king, Ozymandias, erected this statue so that anyone who came to his city would look upon the grandeur and almost despair, like, wow, look at how powerful this kingdom is. These people could come crush us at any time if they wanted. So he said, look upon my works, ye mighty, and despair. But interestingly enough, what becomes the real brilliance of this poem is the juxtaposition that Percy Shelley makes, because in our modern day, thousands of years later, there is nothing left but just the two legs of stone of this statue. So when the modern day traveler reads the message, look on my works, ye mighty, and despair, the message that the modern day traveler gets is that the power of time is the most powerful force on the planet, right? This king who made himself a vast empire that he thought would never fade away now is nothing more but just an empty landscape of sand that stretches far away as the eye can see. So at the end of the day, what the message really reinforces is that time and decay are the most powerful forces on the planet, and they will have dominion over everything. And so this poem just becomes such a brilliant juxtaposition, you know, with the message on the pedestal that really strikes us about, you know, the haunting power of decay and time. So this is just a really beautiful, well-written poem. It's easily Percy Shelley's most famous poem. And I encourage you to read it a time or two again, because it's just fantastic. So I hope you enjoyed it, and I look forward to seeing you on the next walkthrough.